Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I want to do the knitting book tag created by Cara over at the channel Wild Book Garden in honor of her booktube birthday. Congratulations, Cara. In addition to having this great channel of her own, she's an extremely clever and compassionate commenter as well. Thanks, Cara. Happy book birthday, belatedly. Cara is a knitter, as am I, and I think both of us must have been called back to the yarn with the return of cooler weather in the Northern Hemisphere. The questions are related to particular fiber-related goodness. But if you're not a crafter, no worries. You don't need to know how to knit to understand the prompts. If you are interested in more discussion of knitting, aimed at least partly at non-knitters, I'll link to a video down in the description box, which I made soon after I started my channel. Incidentally, in celebration of this topic, today I am wearing a sweater my grandmother knit, possibly before I was even born, or shortly thereafter. Well, let's get started with the tag. When you start a knitting project, the first thing you do is cast on, or establish the initial stitches on which the rest of your project will be built, so to speak. And the tag prompt that goes along with cast on, essentially, how do you get started on a new reading project? That is, what's the first section you scope out in a library or bookstore? I love to check out the new books titles at the library, especially the narrative nonfiction shelves. And after new books, I often gravitate to the memoir and biography section. Recently, I've been reading a lot of memoirs about disability and illness. I'm also quite fond of biographies of authors, composers, artists, etc. To be honest, since COVID began, I have not gone inside any bookstore other than the Brattle in Boston. And when I go in the library at home, right outside of Washington, D.C., I pretty much only go to my whole shelf to pick up whatever I've already ordered. At some point, I'm looking forward to the idea of spending hours in a bookstore on a rainy day, poring over random books that I want to look at, but have no intention of actually reading, much less buying. The second prompt is knit, the most common stitch in knitting, and a word that's come to stand for the whole process. The prompt here, name a super hyped book that completely delivered for you. I think I'll name Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall books. Sometimes I read books before they get hyped a lot, or at least manage to miss most of the pre-pub hype. But in Mantel's case, Wolf Hall was a blockbuster by the time I picked it up. I absolutely loved it, and I'm looking forward to reading it again so I can really think about the writing technique she was using and the choices she was making. The hype was completely deserved. The third prompt is purl. The purl stitch is the other basic stitch in knitting. Knit stitches and purl stitches are closely related, and in a way are sort of inverses of each other. One brief nerdy sentence for the knitters in the crowd. Ambidextrous people can knit one row, then without turning the project, knit back using the other hand, and they'll produce exactly the same stitches that another knitter would produce if he or she turned the project and purled across the row. But anyway, the purl stitch gets none of the glory, even though it's nearly as important as the knit stitch. So the prompt for purl is to name a character you think deserves more love, from fandom, the author, other characters, etc. I really love Charlotte Lucas in Pride and Prejudice. She's not wealthy, she's kind of plain, and in Jane Austen's book, she's pretty sure that at 27, she's too old to get married, despite the fact that marriage could not only give her a sense of stability, but provide one for her whole family. She's not a romantic, so much so that she sometimes seems almost cold, but she's smart, and she finds a way to create that stability for herself and her family, even though there's a cost. In addition to loving her practical and forthright perspective, I think her presence in Pride and Prejudice makes it clear how much Elizabeth's choices are only possible because of growing up with a certain amount of money, which gave her at least some sense of privilege. This is the kind of thing that turns Austen's books into a great romance and a great discussion of gender and social class during the Georgian period. Prompt number 4, chart. A book or author you've been meaning to read, but somehow just haven't gotten around to, and why. Knitting charts are a visual way to represent written directions for more complicated knitting, especially for cables, lace knitting, and color work. I absolutely love a good chart and find it much easier to follow than a string of symbols written in a list. I highly suggest giving it a try. It does, however, take a few minutes to get what is going on, and sometimes it just feels easier to do what you already know how to do. Same with reading. I occasionally have a tendency to be a bit nervous about classic authors I never read. For more of a problem, I find very long books, more than about 800 pages or so, to be really intimidating to pick up, even though I know I often love them when I do pick them up. So for this prompt, a book you haven't gotten around to, I'll tell you about the beautiful box set of Proust's volumes In Search of Lost Time, which have been sitting on my shelf for nearly a decade, and which I still have not read. My mother's 3-volume set of Proust, called Remembrance of Things Past, was a set I looked at on her bookshelves almost every day for many years. In fact, it's sort of my own personal Proustian Madeleine. Random aside, when I was looking online for a good Madeleine recipe, I ran across the name and address of a woman who lives fairly near me, Marilynne Proust. No kidding. Anyway, I was all set to follow along on Steve Donahue's Proustimber, which he turned into Proustober and then Proustvember, all the way to Proust Brewery and then Proustgus at the end of the summer. You let us down, Steve. My husband, on the other hand, who used to be a less serious reader than I, went ahead and finished the first volume, and maybe even the second as well, I think. He's also finished War and Peace, which I still have not. And he's really committed to working through the rest of Joyce's Ulysses with me, too. I have some serious work ahead to catch up with him. Well, on to the 5th prompt, double-pointed needles, or DPNs. DPNs are usually used for knitting in the round, rather than knitting back and forth. In other words, you can knit in a way other than the standard direction. So the bookishly parallel prompt is to recommend a series you can actually read out of order, as well as one that people might think you can, but you actually can't. I'm afraid I tend to read standalone books in general, so I'm not sure I have a perfect answer here. When I was young, I was pretty obsessed with Nancy Drew, which I read out of order since I didn't really have any other option. I grew up in a small town with no bookstore. I picked up what I could in the spinner rack at a local craft store, which carried a handful of books, mostly for young people. I checked out everything I could from the library, but they had a limited collection. Some of the books I read were current editions at the time, but many were from previous generations, where Nancy Drew's hair color or shoe style or whatever were quite specifically based on the styles popular when and where they were published. Those distinctions seem to matter more than the order of the novels. Although I don't remember what author or detective it was, I managed to read several mystery novels in a row in order of publication, and while it was in no way essential to read them in order, it was interesting to see subtle changes in how relationships between characters developed over time. I suppose my other favorite order question is Narnia books by C.S. Lewis. Even if you decide to read them in order, the question arises of which order to read them in. 5 of the books seem to follow an obvious path, but 2 of the books are sometimes inserted in the order in which they were published, and sometimes in internal chronological order, that is, in order of when the plot's actions occur. When I was a child, I'm pretty sure I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe first. When my son was young and I reread the books, I started with The Magician's Nephew. To be honest, while I really love Magician's Nephew, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe casts the kind of magic spell that really pulls kids into these books, and I think it might be the preferable place to start. Prompt number 6 is Cables, a book you've heard negative reviews for, but you ended up loving. I too am a huge fan of Cables, as is Cara. I love the way they look, and I find them tremendously fun to knit, not nearly as hard as I thought they would be. My first cable project was a sweater for our son back when he was little. Here he is wearing it while doing a little bit of spinning. The second cable sweater was for me, this collared cardigan, which is still a favorite. For this tag prompt about a book you've heard negative reviews of, I'll use a book I often mention in tags, Victorian author Anthony Trollope's book, The Warden. It's a short little thing, which begins the Barsetshire series. Over and over, I've heard that nothing happens in the first book, but the rest of the series is so good that it's worth getting introduced to the characters. Just don't give up until you've gone to the next book. Well, I loved The Warden. It's a quiet, gentle little book about an older man who's grappling with how to be a good person, and it's sweet and sweetly funny, too. It might not have the excitement of knitting cables, but there's actually something pretty meditative about both. Prompt 7 is, as Cara says, skein. Why do we sell yarn like this? The word skein often refers to hanks of yarn, which are essentially loops or loose coils of yarn gently and magically twisted together after the yarn has been spun, but before it's used or sold. Cara points out how disastrous it can be to try to knit straight from a skein. You're just going to wind up with knots galore, a frustrating experience that's likely to end with you in a huff and the yarn in the trash. Instead, knitters first have to spend time turning their hanks into balls of yarn. So Cara's prompt is a trope you can't stand. Heavily used themes or plot devices or other elements we commonly call tropes these days can make a book feel immediately comfortable or even powerful, but they can also just be signs of lazy writing. I guess my least favorite trope is probably the idea of a chosen one, a character who, for no reason other than one's situation at birth, is destined to save the world in some way. I have loved books with this trope, but there has to be a lot else in the book for me to love a book that relies on this kind of arc. I think there's some fairly complicated reasons why the chosen one idea sets me off, and I need to do a bit more thinking about it before I can really unravel my thoughts. Unravel. On the theme of more literal unraveling, I want to give a defense of skeins of yarn. Yes, they give knitters an extra job to do before they even pick up their needles. But if the yarn is being stored for any length of time, storing it in hanks or skeins means there's no tension on the yarn, as there would be if it were stored as rolled balls. So the yarn won't get overstretched in some places. It'll stay bouncy, and it'll therefore knit up more evenly. Also, if you ever do any spinning, and I only barely have, you'll probably create those skeins yourself, which will allow you to set the twist, kind of a long story that I won't go into here. Here's a tip for a serious knitter who has a lot of skeins of yarn to turn into balls. Consider investing in an umbrella swift and a ball minder. Both are tools that have been around forever, completely hand-powered, and can be relatively inexpensive if you don't go for the gorgeous handmade wooden ones, which I occasionally covet. It makes the whole process easy and very fast. The 8th prompt is gauge swatch, that little square knitters make before starting a project to measure how many stitches are in each inch, both horizontally and vertically, which is especially important if you're knitting a garment that requires a specific fit. Some people knit loosely, and some are much tighter knitters. You can totally get by without swatching for shawls and scarves, But to get a perfect fit for a sweater, you usually need to knit a swatch, unless you followed the patterns of a specific knitwear designer enough to know that your gauge, the designer's gauge, and your chosen yarn are all on the same page. Proper gauge will give you a perfect fit. So, the bookish parallel Cara came up with is to ask us to share an author who is always a good fit for us. I think I'll say Marilynne Robinson here. I absolutely adored Housekeeping, which I read when it first came out, and then passed on to my mother, who also loved it. It might be the novel I've read most often by a living author. I think so. Although Housekeeping is still very much my favorite of Robinson's books, I also adore the Gilead series, especially the first book in the series. I'm far less obsessed by her nonfiction, but still, I would never hesitate to read anything she wrote. Prompt 9 is stitch marker. In knitting, stitch markers are ways you temporarily mark your knitting to help you find a particular place, which you might do to remind you to increase or decrease your stitches in particular spots, or to show where to start a lace repeat or a cable pattern, or where to measure from, etc. Sometimes stitch markers can clip into the knitting, and sometimes they're rings that stay with a needle rather than connected to the fabric. Cara asks us in this tag to share a specific scene that stands out clearly in your mind. One I first read when I was quite young was from Harper Lee's book To Kill a Mockingbird. That book is now considered outdated, if not explicitly racist. But that is not at all what its impact was on white readers when it first came out. The book changed the minds of many people, and in some ways contributed to the successes of the civil rights movement. Historical circumstances can change how we understand books. What seems progressive at one moment might feel regressive in later decades. We will almost certainly feel that about the books we most value now when we look back on them later in our lives. Anyway, the scene I love so much in To Kill a Mockingbird is when the child protagonist, Scout, is required to read to the explicitly racist, crotchety old lady who is their neighbor. Scout is annoyed by her, and also pretty afraid of her. What we come to understand is that the elderly woman is dying, and she's addicted to the morphine that has provided her with pain relief. She wants to die free of the addiction. And the reason Scout is there, although she doesn't know it, is to support the woman as she goes through withdrawals. Scout's father, Atticus, says the woman is an example of courage, willing to do what she thinks is right, even though she will soon die, whether she's taking morphine or not. That idea of having the courage to do what you think is right, even in situations where you know you cannot win, is one of several main themes in the book. This particular scene struck me so hard when I was a young reader, I think, because it portrayed a deeply unpleasant person with a great deal of humanity and compassion, something I don't think I'd really seen in literature before. Prompt number 10 is yarn weight, and is, as Cara says, super useful info to take in at a glance. Comparing the weight of your yarn to its yardage allows you to decide what kind of knitting project might be most appropriate for a given yarn. Basically, it tells you the thinness or thickness of the yarn. 100 grams of yarn with only 200 yards might be appropriate for a relatively heavy sweater, while 100 grams with 900 yards might make a delicate lace shawl. You have to find the right match. If a pattern calls for a particular yarn, learning its yarn weight allows you to choose other yarns that will knit up in very similar ways. The bookish parallel for this prompt: do you have some bookish taste buddies? Someone you have really similar taste to in general, or for a specific kind of book? Well, I certainly have found a lot of people whose tastes I think gel with mine here on BookTube. I'll name just a couple. While I don't read nearly as broadly as Roz at scally-daddling about the books, most of the classic novels I love are also favorites of hers. When she recommends similar books, I usually snap them up or put them on hold at the library, and they almost always become new favorites. I also really love the way she thinks about books, with a sense of why books are interesting or important historically, why they were written as they were when they were written. But at the same time, she talks in a very personal and emotional way that feels very much like how I think about what I read. I listen very carefully when Kim at Middle of the Book March makes recommendations, as I do when Sandy at Miss Reads a Lot or Tori at Good Strong Words do. I also really love Gina Stanier's recommendations for gentle, cozy reads. I have a couple of other people in mind, but I want to talk about them and their channels in an upcoming video, so I'll stop with this crew for right now. I love prompt number 11, which references, quote, that novelty yarn someone gifted you because they heard you like knitting, but it's impossible to work with. Novelty yarn is sometimes really crazy looking, like eyelashes are hanging off the yarn, or like sparkly ladders or whatever. But sometimes it's much more appealing. There was a trend, maybe a dozen years ago, to sell yarn made from the threads that were swept up in factories that made saris. The yarn was gorgeous, rich jewel tones mixed in subtle ways, sparkly yet still quite subtle. I loved the way it looked, but I hated the way it felt to knit, and I disliked the way the knitted objects hung, the way they felt. So the parallel bookish tag prompt, what's a book that looked perfect for you on paper, but just didn't work out? I had high hopes that Delia Owen's Where the Crawdads Sing would be a hit for me. A supposedly beautifully written atmospheric book about a young female protagonist in eastern North Carolina, where I grew up, sounded perfect. But I couldn't stand the book. From now on, thanks to Cara's question, I will think of Where the Crawdads Sing as a sorry scrap yarn kind of book. Prompt number 12 is Scarf, the perfect starter project. Recommend a good book for getting into a genre or kind of book. An enormous number of readers, especially women readers who love to read Victorian classics, all started with the same book, often back when they were 13 or so. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. I loved the book then, and I still love it deeply. Of course, there are people who hate it enough to throw their volume across the room, and if I'm remembering correctly, Cara might be one of them. But even if readers get angry about certain aspects of the book, Jane Eyre is a book that draws you in, even if you get angry. I can imagine that even if you were horrified by particular people's taste in men or whatever, Jane Eyre could still convince you that you might want to read a lot of other Victorian fiction. Or at least that's my argument for today. But back to scarves for a moment. You've all seen and probably worn a hand-knitted scarf at some point, but I want to show you a few of my favorite knits. This subtly striped scarf, modeled by my handsome husband several years ago. A purple dragon scarf modeled by my son back when he was little. And an alligator scarf I knit for my brother for the holidays one year. The next prompt is handmade socks, which are, perhaps unexpectedly, quite a serious project. Knitting socks can be really fiddly, especially if you use thin yarn. A beautiful pair of socks might take you at least a couple of weeks, even if you knit a couple of hours a day, and all the while you'll be working on short, double-pointed needles that essentially look like toothpicks. There's a lot of beautiful hand-dyed sock yarn out there that can be really expensive, too. So for gift socks, you might be paying at least $20 or more just for the yarn, then spend hours and hours of knitting to create a gorgeous pair of socks as a gift for a non-knitter who just thinks, socks, I could buy these on Amazon for $1 a pair. Well, no. So the bookish prompt. Talk about an underappreciated author who deserves more hype. I'm going to name Tillie Olsen. Most of her work, fiction and nonfiction, was published in the 1960s and 1970s. Olsen was a feminist who was also more aware of the impact of class than many popular white female authors of her time. Her short story, I Stand Here Ironing, is widely anthologized and widely taught, but most of her small body of work has more or less been ignored. I recommend you start with her story collection, Tell Me a Riddle, and then give her nonfiction book, Silences, a go. At some point, I really ought to make a video about Tillie Olsen and maybe do a reading of I Stand Here Ironing, too. Prompt number 14 is cast off, sometimes called bind off, which is the way you finish the actual knitting, although you might need to seam pieces together or sew in loose ends before you finish the whole project. Most people celebrate those bind off moments, even if we're sad to see a project come to its end. The parallel booked prompt: name a weirdly specific thing you love, a specific trope, something in book construction, etc. For me, the answer is footnotes. I love them in academic nonfiction, in contemporary novels, perhaps especially in annotated classics. Too often, publishers, even university presses, require footnotes to be turned into endnotes, so readers have to flip back and forth in order to read them. Why would people want to have to do that? And often commercially published nonfiction doesn't even put those little numbers in the text. So you just have to look back there to see if anything is listed for a particular page. Well, I know not many people will agree with me, and I also know that coming clean about my footnote passion just confirms my nerdiness, but so be it. Footnotes forever. On to the very last part of the tag, and that is the crafting party. As Cara says, one of the best parts of any hobby is sharing it with friends. Tag some people who craft, or who might like to answer the questions. I'll tag 2 people today. Jason, the crocheter, over at the great channel Old Blues Chapter and Verse, and Kate Howe, one of the booktubers who helped start not only Victober, but also Knit and Listen, a group read-along, which made me finally start reading George Eliot a few years ago. Well, thank you so much for this great tag, Cara, and happy BookTube birthday, and thanks to all of you for joining me here today on Hannah's Books. See you soon.